Good evening, everyone. And tonight we start our kind of mini series within the prophet series on symbolic actions in prophecy. And tonight we're going to start with Hoshea. And again, we're going kind of in chronological order. So really we're going to be looking at Hoshea, Yirmiyahu, and Yechezkel, right? I'm not looking at symbolic visions in prophecy. Okay, there are a lot of those, yo, Yirmiyahu, tell me what you see. I see a boiling pot. Okay, I don't have a lot to add, frankly, when we talk in terms of symbolic visions. I personally find them kind of a little frustrating. Sometimes they work on puns, sometimes they don't work on puns. I don't find them particularly illuminating, so I'm not going to really address them. I don't have much to add to symbolic visions, but we are going to be talking about symbolic actions. And my approach is really looking at each prophet on his own because their approaches are so different. What the symbolic actions are doing is so different for each prophet that I don't like to have us to think single theory going across the board of what the prophets are doing. I had a postdoc once where the person who was in charge of the postdocs wanted to kind of force me into doing a general approach to symbolic actions in prophecy. And he really didn't like that I was doing different approaches for different prophets. And I'm sorry, I'm a tree versus forest person in this respect, especially when they really are doing such different things. Maybe someday I'll come to some overarching explanation, but for now, we're going to do it by prophet. So we're starting with Hoshea. Once again, we're starting with the earliest prophet in the prophets we're going to look at. What's interesting about Hoshea and what's a big part of his symbolic actions is the fact that Hoshea is the first prophet to use this analogy of God is to Israel as a husband is to a wife. This is, frankly, if we weren't so used to it, we would find it a lot more shocking, right? And the first time we see it is with Hoshea. And you can say, well, the first time, well, Hoshea is pretty early, and he is pretty early, certainly among classical prophets. And he is the first one who's talking about Israel is God's wife, as it were, or we can see Israel as God's wife, and we can see the relationship between God and Israel like the relationship between a husband and wife, in particular, an unfaithful wife, right? As I've noted before, and I'm going to say this before we dive in because we're not doing the whole book. Tonight, we're going to specifically look at symbolic actions. As I've noted before, the whole point of depicting this relationship as a relationship between husband and wife is so that the audience who think that it's no big deal to go to other gods, as it were, or to go to other nations, and ally themselves with these overarching nations like Assyria or Egypt, and they're like, "What's the big deal? I need rain. I go to Baal. I need something else. I can go to the God of Israel. What's the problem?" And the answer is, would you want your wife to go to other men for things? And the answer, of course, is no. She's not allowed to do that, right? Well, you're not allowed to do that because you're like God's wife, right? That's your relationship, and you owe God exclusivity. Okay, so that is a big part of what Hoshea is talking about, but at the same time, Hoshea is building also on this idea, not just of owing your husband exclusivity, but a relationship between a relationship that involves love and hurt feelings, right? In other words, it's not just a contractual obligation that Hoshea is talking about. Hoshea really is talking about a relationship where there's kind of God's like, I gave you everything, right? And so that we can understand a feeling of betrayal, and also that there is this feeling of love, of let us renew our original love that we had when we first kind of joined together, as it were. All right, so let's dive in, because really we're talking about symbolic actions here. So let's dive in to the beginning of Hoshea, which starts with a symbolic action. Let me make sure that I've got the right thing here. Hold on just a moment. There we go. Okay. Now we're going to look in, we're also in an unusual move for me. I'm also going to bring something, or rather in this class, at least, I am going to bring something from Chazal, from the Talmud later on, because it is certainly informed the way I, when I first encountered this text, the way I saw it, but we're going to talk about that in just a second, in terms of what does this symbolic action mean? How can one understand this? Okay, so let me go back to the very beginning of Hoshea. All right, so Dvar Hashem Asher Haya El Hoshea ben Be'eri. So the word of God that was to Hoshea, the son of Be'eri. Here are Bimei Uzziah, Yotam, Achaz, Yechizkiah, Machayohan, during all these kings of Yehuda, Uvimei, and this is the important part, Yeravam ben Yoash, the king of Melech Israel. Hoshea is prophesying in Israel. He's prophesying at the time of Yeravam, the son of Yoash. Yeravam, the son of Yoash, rules from 786 to either 748 or 746. I've seen two different accounts. I think the one to 746 is ignoring his son Zechariah. But at any rate, 786 to 748, let's say. And Hoshea is prophesying in the 740s around. He's prophesying, so he's prophesying against this dynasty of Yehu. You guys remember Yehu? He was that super violent and charismatic rebel who took over the kingship. He ended the dynasty of Achav, the dynasty of Omri rather, in a spectacularly violent fashion. Yeravam actually is far down. So you have Yehu, his son is Yehoachaz, Yehoachaz's son is Yoash, and Yoash's son is Yeravam. Yeravam is the last great king of this dynasty. He does well as a king. He conquers areas. He does fairly well. The dynasty ends with his son immediately. His son gets to the throne and is killed is killed pretty much close to right away. I don't know right away, but he's quickly killed, and that is the end of Yehu's dynasty. So here God speaks to Hoshea. Tchilat diber Adonai beHoshea. Okay, when God first spoke to Hoshea is the literal meaning. The meaning that's always been in Chazal, in the Talmud, that's been explained is the first time that God spoke was to Hoshea, right? And they don't mean at all, they mean of the classical prophets, of our book prophets, and that's why Hoshea is considered the first book prophet traditionally. That's why Hoshea is at the beginning of the 12 prophets, whereas Amos probably is before Hoshea, just from what he's talking about. Amos seems to be before Hoshea. Not just because of what he's talking about, to be honest, but also because of what he's talking about. It's traditionally Hoshea is placed before Amos, and so traditionally in the books he is also before Amos. Okay, so here we are, God's first speaking to Hoshea. We don't get any of the kind of dedications we were looking at in our earlier class. Instead, what does God say to Hoshea? Lech kach lecha eshet znunim v'yaldei znunim ki zanot tizneh haaretz me'acharei Hashem. So God says to Hoshea, he says, go take a woman who is I like how they did a wife of harlotry. It seems to be a woman, either a woman who's a known prostitute or a woman who is known to be unfaithful. I think probably a known prostitute, and she has children from her behavior. So she has children of she's a prostitute. She has children of prostitution. Take this woman for a wife because the land is itself essentially betraying God, right? Is having adulterous affairs. All right. So he goes and he takes a known person, Gomer bat Divlayim. And now I'm not going to talk about, obviously, Chazal and in Talmudic explanations in Midrash, there are explanations of what the name means. What I see is that this is a known person. In other words, you should know, oh yeah, her. Okay, Hoshea did it, right? God said, take a harlot. He took a harlot because it was Gomer bat Divlai, and we all know who she is. That's the impression that I get. Like she's a known person that he marries, and she has a son. All right, and now we get to our next symbolic action. God says, call him Yisrael. Why Yisrael? Ki od ma'at ufakadati et dmei Yisrael al bet Yehu vishpati mamlechut bet Yisrael. So because in just a little while, I am going to remember, or I'm going to kind of take revenge for the blood of Israel against the house of Yehu, and I will end the kingdom of the house of Israel. Now, I want to just clarify some things. So in fact, the dynasty of Yehu ends very shortly after Yoravam ben Yoash's death. At the same time, there are a few kings afterward, but it's very unstable afterwards. Afterwards, what you have is just a bunch of usurper kings, right? So it's a very unstable situation after this fairly long dynasty for Israel, at least for the Northern Kingdom. I think it's the longest dynasty there is, and it ends. And after that, you have a bunch of it's a very unstable time. So it's not quite the end of Israel yet, but it's close to it. And this is going to start a very unstable period. What does this mean? That God is going to essentially take revenge or remember the blood of Israel? Who remembers from when we were talking? Who remembers the Yehu? This is the massacre that Yehu did essentially against the whole house of Achav. If you remember, he just killed everyone. All of his sons. He had a literal mountain of skulls, right? So he was very violent, and he really did kill everyone. At the time, when we learned that passage, I noted that even from the text, it seems like it's a little perhaps overboard. In other words, okay, he was told to do this, but wow, he's being really thorough, and he seems to kind of enjoy it in a cynical way. He's got this very interesting, on the one hand, he's ruthless. On the other hand, you can see he's tremendously charismatic. And at this point, this is going to be the chickens are going to come home to roost. He's going to be held to account for this. Why? I think here we can, it does make sense to kind of go with the explanation that because the whole point of Yehu was that he stopped the worship of the Baal, but if now they're worshiping idols anyway, if his house is encouraging the worshiping of foreign gods, then he has to be held to account for what did you kill those other guys for then, right? So if you massacred everyone because they were worshiping other gods, and now your guys are worshiping other gods, then those were murders, right? So I think that's actually a decent explanation, right? At the same time, again, I think you were even in the text in Kings where you read it, I did feel you are supposed to be at least a little bit shocked by just how violent and just how complete his massacre of the entire family of Achav and his allies is. Okay, so on that day, God continues, V'shavarti et keshet Yisrael be'emek Yisrael. On that day, I am going to break the bow of Israel in the valley of Yisrael. In other words, they will be defeated. They will not be able to fight. V'tahar od v'teled bat, and then she had a girl, and he said, call her lo ruchama. She will not be the object of compassion, right? I will have no compassion. She will not be the object of compassion. Ki lo osif od arachem et bet Yisrael ki naso esalahem. He says, I am not going to continue to have compassion for the house of Israel or bear the burden of their sin. That's it. I'm done. Okay. Now that punishment is coming. Remember, there's this idea that sin is born by God, and eventually someone's got to pay. Okay, I'm not bearing this anymore. They're going to pay for their sin. So the sons Yisrael, because that's where punishment's going to come from. That's what the punishment is for, and that's where the battle is supposed to be. Lo Ruchama, the girl she's not going to be the object of mercy, and that's supposed to be she's standing in for the house of Israel, right? And he says, "Et Bet Yehuda rachem." Okay, but the house of Yehuda, God's going to have compassion for. Remember, he's talking to the house of Israel. All right. And then Lo Ruchama is weaned. And now that the baby's weaned, she can get pregnant. Gomer can get pregnant again. And she does. She gets pregnant and she has a son. And God tells Hoshea, call the son Lo Ami, not my nation, right? This is the exact opposite of a theophoric name. A theophoric name would have something like my nation, my people, my father, my brother, right? And they say, no, not my people, okay? Not my people. Ki atem lo ami v'anochi lo eyeh lachem. Because you are not my people and I will not be yours. I will not belong to you. So this is super, super crazy harsh, right? And Hoshea is supposed to illustrate this to the people through his own marriage and children. All right. He's married a woman who cannot be trusted to be faithful. She's having children, and the children are named for this horrible stuff that's coming. Forget, you can't rely on the fact that you're my nation. You're not my nation anymore, and I have had it, says God. Okay. Now this is pretty crappy because these kids are walking around with these names, right? Let's go on and see whether they're supposed to continue forever, and it's a little bit hard to tell. We're going to a future with hope. Just for now, we're going to skip forward to a future with hope. All right.
Miriam?
Yes.
But it says she bore the children to him. So is there a possibility that they are his children? And
no, I think those kids are supposed to be his kids. I honestly think that I think the idea is supposed to be he married a prostitute. She brings her kids that she's already got, right, from her years as a prostitute, right? You know, they didn't have birth control. So she has children, right? He has to take those on, right? And she bears him children. Okay. Now, while I don't think we're supposed to think that these aren't his kids. Okay. We are supposed to think that it's really hard to marry a woman like that and maybe kind of wonder in the back of your mind. But I don't think we're really supposed to think that these aren't his kids. I think they're supposed to be his kids. Okay. Is that what you were asking?
Yes, that's what I'm asking. Miriam, This is also a theme in literature about a man taking on a fallen woman and making her okay. And we can talk about examples later, but this is a theme.
I mean, you could have done that if there was anything like that in this text, right? On the contrary, you're like identifying her in her nature as being an Eshet Znunim. You know, it would be nice for us to read into it. Oh, he's rehabilitating her. She's being defined by the fact that she's a prostitute. He's taking her because she's a prostitute, right? And it's. I wish I could be like, oh yeah, and the whole point is, here's a woman who, and let's continue. Let's continue on and see kind of how the metaphor plays out. So now we're going to jump a little bit ahead to a more hopeful time, right? Okay. In other words, in the future, the number of Israel will be like the sand of the sea that can't be measured. And instead of being said to them, you are not my nation, it will be said to them, you are the children of the living God. That's beautiful, right? And here's this hope for reconciliation. And I always wonder, so did he get to change the kid's name back? I don't know. It doesn't say that, okay? And in that time, Yehuda and Yisrael are going to join together. They're going to have one head. They're going to rise up from the land. Ki gadol yom Yisrael, because the day of Yisrael will be great. In other words, imru la'achechem ami v'la'achotechem ruchama. Say to your brothers, my nation, and to your sisters, you will receive compassion. Okay. Okay. So clearly, you're taking Hoshea's kids, and you're like, this can be reversed. You've got 3 kids. Yisrael, right? Lo Ami and Lo Ruchama. right? So you've got Israel, which is supposed to be this defeat. You've got lo ami, not my nation, and you've got not going to receive compassion, not going to be essentially forgiven. And you say now, the day of Israel will be good, will be great. In other words, Israel could be a defeat or it could be a day of rising up and doing what's right and a return to God, in which case Israel's name is a good name, right? And you could say to my brother, remember Hoshea's son is Lo Ami, you should say to my brother, Ami, my nation. Say to your sister, again, his daughter is Lo Ruchama, should not receive compassion. Ruchama receives compassion. So in other words, these children who have these horrible names, all those names can be changed and reversed to be good and to be better than good, to be wonderful. How do you do it? Rivu b'imchem rivu. Rivu. You should argue with your mother, ki hi lo ishti v'anochi lo isha, because she is not my wife and I am not her husband. V'taser znuneha mipaneha v'na'afufeha miben shada, and she should remove her, it's like her fornication from her face and her fornication from between her breasts. I think what it's saying is get her makeup off and take off her ornaments that she wears between her breasts, right? She should take off these things that she's using to attract men, right? Now, so what is this metaphor? The younger generation should argue either with their leaders or the older generation, or not the younger generation, but the non-leaders should argue with the leaders, right? And say no. No. Why? Because she, and here is the Knesset, the community of Israel is not my wife and I am not her husband in this state. You need to argue with her and you need to get her to not worship other gods. Remove these things, right? Remove these things with which she's, whether it's actually meant to symbolize like temples to idol worship or the idols themselves, that could very well be even amulets of other gods, in a more concrete way, right? But the same way you would imagine the father saying to his kids, tell your mother to stop acting this way. I am telling how are you going to get back to being my nation and receiving compassion? By arguing with the older generation / the leaders and getting them to stop this idol worship. Okay, what is the alternative? Penav shitena aruma b'yitzaktiha kiyom hivalda, lest I strip her and present her as on the day of her birth. I'm going to present her naked. Now, this could be a hint to a punishment for adulterous women to be stripped naked in the square. But it's very quickly going to go to something else. V'samtiha chamidbar v'shatiha ka'eretzia. I'm going to make her a wilderness. Okay. Now it's not just yes, midbar means wilderness. Eretzia means like a dry land. V'hamitia batzama, and I will kill her with thirst. Now we're going to see that, or we're actually not going to see because we're not going to do the whole book now, unfortunately. Midbar, the wilderness here, is also hinting to something else, because something that Hoshea wants very much, or is presenting very much, is this idea of going back to day zero, going back to the wilderness when our love was fresh, right? When our love was new, and we and Israel was God's nation and had this kind of clear of everything else. We had no land yet. It was a new empty area. Going back to that state, that pure state, to renew the relationship between God and his people, right? And that's a theme in Hosea, and it's hinted to a little here, that even in this thing of this is what I'm going to do to your mother, I'm going to strip her bare, and I'm going to put her in a wilderness, she's going to die of thirst. There is this hint to, we're going to go back to the wilderness. We're going to reset. We're going to do a reset. Okay. But right now we're still in punishment mode. And I will not pity or have mercy on her sons, because they are the children of prostitution. Right? Because their mother prostituted herself, right? Their parent has acted shamefully. Ki amra elcha achrei ma'avai notnei lachmi umeimai tzamri ufishti shamni v'shikuyai. She said, I'm going to go after my lovers who are giving me bread and water and wool and flax and oil and things to drink, right? And so just who is she going after? So in this analogy, it's probably talking about foreign gods. It's also maybe talking about, because this is another theme in Hoshea, is running after alliances with Assyria to the north or Egypt to the south, right? And saying they're the ones that are going to kind of bring salvation. לכן הנני סח את דרכך בסירים וגדרתי את גדרה ונתיבותיה לא תמצא. I'm going to block her path. Why? Because she's running after her lovers. So I'm going to block her path with thorns, right? I'm going to be cruel in order to keep you away from your lovers, right? And she's going to run after her lovers. She's not going to catch up to them. She's going to seek to search for them. She's not going to find them. And then she's going to say, V'amra elcha v'ashuva elishi harishon ki tov li az me'ata. I'm going to go back to my first husband because then it was better than now. And it's kind of sad, right? It's kind of sad because she's not going back to her first husband because she really found her love for her first husband. She's like, I can't get to my lovers. I can't get to them. Things are horrible. Better for me to go back to my first husband. V'hi lo yad'a ki anochi natati la hadagan batirosh bayitzar because of her beti la b'zahav asul la'ba'al. She doesn't know that I, God, gave her, right? I gave her the grain and the grapes and the olive oil and I gave her a lot of silver and gold, and she gave it to the Baal. So she's worshiping Baal, right? And so I'm going to go back and I'm going to take it all back from her, right? I'm going to take back the grain. I'm going to take back what she's using to cover herself, and then I'm going to. And because I'm taking back what she used to cover herself, the wool and the flax, she's going to be bare to her lovers, and it's just awful, right? Everything's gonna be destroyed. I'm gonna punish her for all these days that she is worshiping these other gods, right? And then you get back, and this is what I was talking about before, this idea that, okay, so we'll do a reset. God's going to take it all away, and then there's going to be a reset, okay? לכן הנה אנוכי מפתחה והולכתיה המדבר ודיברתי על ליבה. I am going to tempt her, I'm going to seduce her, I'm going to bring her to the wilderness, and I'm going to speak to her heart. All right. And then I'm going to give her everything from there, right? Ve'anta shama kimenu raha. And she's going to answer there as in the days of her youth, ukiyom alotam eretz Yisrael, as on the day she came up from the land of Egypt. V'haya bayom hahu ne'um Adonai tikri'i ishi v'lo tikri'i li od ba'ali. And on that day, you will call me ishi, my husband, in the pure my man, right, as it were, and you will not call me anymore my husband, my Baal. Now, basiroti et shemot ha'ba'alim mipiha, and I'm going to take away the language of the Ba'alim from her mouth. And she's not going to use their name anymore. So she's not going to call me my husband, but she's going to use the pure biblical word ishi. Now you have Baal also in the biblical meaning of husband. I do want to point out that if you look at the Chamisha Chumshei Torah, the Pentateuch, if you're looking at where does it use Ish for husband and where does it use Baal for husband, usually when it's using Baal for husband, it is in fact in the meaning of someone who has kind of ownership of the woman's stuff or responsibility, for example, for her oaths. It uses that word usually specifically in a case where it's emphasizing the husband's control over her or her actions or what she owns. The usual word for husband would be ish. Now, of course, Hoshea is playing with it here. All right, they clearly use the word Baal for husband, and he's playing with it here, saying you're not going to use that word anymore. You're going to be that far from worshiping the Baal that you're not even going to say. Now, note that he says Baalim in plural because, as I've noted before, you have a Baal. You have Baal Zavul, you have Baal Zavul rather. You have all sorts of different Baalim, right? And a Baal of a different place would be considered a different Baal. that they're worshiping. So we see in the symbolic actions of Hoshea, what's going on. Why does he have to do these actions? And it's in order to really very concretely convey this idea that you are like an unfaithful wife. You are like an unfaithful wife, and you are just like an unfaithful wife. You're running after your lovers. You're leaving your husband behind. He was providing for you. He was doing everything for you. You've forgotten all that. And when do you want to go back to your first husband? When you can't get your lovers anymore, right? Even that is not because of really your love for your first husband. So what God's going to do is he's going to take everything away and he's going to do a reset so that you can rediscover your young love, as it were. Okay. Now, so at the same time, it's kind of shocking where you have a prophet and he's apparently marrying a woman. Again, you could say she's either a known prostitute or a known unfaithful wife. Again, I think the fact that she's being named means that the audience is supposed to say, oh yeah, that really is someone who is known, right, for this. This wasn't a bluff. He did it, right? And then he has to give his kids these terrible names to signal to Israel, you're the kids. You can still reverse this though. These are names, but they're not destiny. I'll remind you, of course, that the whole Greek idea of like destiny that you can't run away from, that doesn't hold true. It doesn't hold true in the Bible. It doesn't hold true in the Near East. It's not the way people think of things. This is something you can stop. You can reverse this. And Hoshea makes it very clear how you have to reverse it. You have to say to your leadership, no, we're not going to worship idols anymore. You have to come back to God. If you don't, everything's going to be taken away from you. And the way you're going to go back to God is through having nothing. That's how it's going to happen. Is that what you want? Is that how it has to happen? Because that's what will happen, right? And it also kind of, on the one hand, why is it important, why does this work as an analogy? It works as an analogy on a couple levels, besides the fact that the audience, who, let's face it, are men, right? They're like, oh yeah, no, that's terrible. Of course a wife can't go and do anything like that. Of course she's not allowed to. So they have to understand that way. And in fact, let me stop my share. And in fact, that's the idea, that you can't just go to other gods and worship them. You can't consider, you're not God's nation if you're going to other gods, right? The same way a woman who betrays her husband can't just assume she can just go back to the first husband just like that. She has basically betrayed him. And at the same time, there are these feelings of betrayal. And there was that feeling of love. There was a love to get back to. There's a belonging that you want to get back to, and that's been broken. Okay. And and there are children, right? There are children who can still get back to something. All right. So on all these levels, it works. And that's why this becomes such a strong idea through the later prophets also, and in later tradition, this idea of Israel being the wife, as it were, of God. And on another level, also, this is important because it is a contract between two responsible parties, as opposed to, and this is something that I think it's not a symbolic action, but I do think are going to address it later in the class. We're going to look at the Yechezkel's description of Israel as an abandoned little girl, right? That Israel was an abandoned little girl that no one adopted. And God kind of watches over her from afar and makes sure she's okay. She grows up and God adorns her and, as it were, marries her. Again, she's Israel. And the question is, well, why? Like, I always remembered it. Most people remember it as, oh, God adopted her. No, God doesn't adopt her. God does not adopt the child. The child grows up and then there's a marriage. Why? Because there has to be reciprocity and there has to be an understanding of this covenant you're entering into. You, Israel, entered a covenant that has reciprocity. If someone adopts a child, they don't, as a little child, there is not the same idea of reciprocity or that the child knew what he was getting into, right? The parent does stuff for the child and the child's a child. But at two people entering a marriage, there is this idea of we're both adults, we're entering into this thing, and there's reciprocity here, right? So that Israel owes God things. It's not just that God does things for Israel and that's it. Israel owes things to God as part of this relationship and this covenant. So that's also another aspect of why this analogy works and why this analogy is picked up so much in through prophets and through tradition. Now, I'm going to pause for questions. So I see there's a chat, and then I want to look a little bit at explanations because the explanations of how you could ask a prophet to do this, right? So let's just, I'll take a break and look in chat. Are these names popular today? Lo Ruchama is not, Ruchama is. So Ruchama is certainly a name, right? So Ruchama is a name I know. Yisrael is not, right? As far as I know, I haven't heard of a kid named Yisrael, but Ruchama, sure, not Lo Ruchama though.
And Ami, no?
Yes.
Ami.
Ami, I know Amit. Amit is a popular name. Ami, yeah, Ami is also a popular name, right? Ami is also a popular name. So how can we understand? And I think in there are a lot of explanations that didn't really happen. He didn't really. It's all just for the analogy. It didn't really happen. But it's very clear that in the text you're supposed to believe it happened. Like in the text, it names his wife. It really sounds like it's supposed to happen. It's telling you, yeah, she weaned the little girl and then she was able to get pregnant again. Like it really seems like you're supposed to buy it. Now that's true also in the Talmud. When the Talmud talks about it, I'm going to share my screen again and we will take a quick look. We're not going to go into, or we're not going to read the Hebrew so much, but it is here. You can see it. Anyone who wants it. This is Psachim Pei Zion, right? In the Bavli, of course, in the Talmud, the regular Babylonian Talmud. So let's do a quick look. I'm going to summarize it here. Do you guys see my screen with Psachim? Yeah. Okay, great. So we're going to read a little bit from the Sensino translation. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. I'm just going to summarize. Because most of it is just from the text, but what it starts with, actually, let's start from the beginning, and then we'll skip ahead. So the word of the Lord came unto Hoshea, son of Be'eri, in the days of Uzziah. Okay, 4 prophets prophesied in one age, and the greatest of all of them was Hoshea. For it is said, the Lord spoke at first with Hoshea, right? Did he then speak first with Hoshea? Were there not many prophets from Moshe until Hoshea? So Rabbi Yochanan, he was the first of 4 prophets who prophesied in that age, and these are they: Hoshea, Yeshayahu, Amos, and Micha. The Holy One, blessed be he, said to Hoshea, your children have sinned. To which he should have replied, they are your children, and they're the children of your family. Hoshea should have, now this is all in the Talmud, right? We don't have this aspect of the dialogue in the text, right? So God said they've sinned, and Hoshea is supposed to defend them. And instead, what does he say? He says, exchange them. He says, the whole world is yours, exchange them for a different nation. That's the last thing a prophet should say. Now, of course, Hoshea doesn't say that in our text, right? But in this, because how can you understand what the command that God gives him? So God's like, what am I going to do with him? I'll tell him to marry a prostitute. Okay. So he says, go marry a prostitute. And what happens is, he's like, okay, had prostitute, name your kids. And then again, this is just in the Talmud. This isn't in the text. This is just in the Talmud. He says, after 2 sons, I'm reading this part now. After 2 sons and 1 daughter were born to him, the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Hoshea, should you not have learned from your teacher Moshe? For as soon as I spoke with him, he parted from his wife. So should you too part from her. In other words, I told Moshe, you know what? You need to come when I call, so you can't have a wife. And Moshe's like, no problem. He left Zipporah. Okay, this is we were not going to get into that now, but he's like, okay, enough is enough. Put her away. I told you to marry this woman, and now just get rid of her. So not get rid of her, but like kind of divorce her, separate from her. Sovereign of the universe, pleaded he, I have children by her, and I can neither expel her nor divorce her. Said the Holy One, blessed be he to him, then if you, whose wife is a harlot, and your children are the children of harlotry, and you do not know whether they are yours or they belong to others, yet you are so, then Israel, who are my children, the children of my tried ones, the people who went through the trials, right? The children of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, one of the 4 possessions which I have acquired in this world, yet you say exchange them for different people? In other words, this whole thing is a lesson to Hoshea. Hoshea, you took a woman you knew she was a prostitute. You knew she wasn't particularly faithful. You had children with her. You don't really know if those children are yours. And I tell you, divorce her, and you're like, I can't. She's my wife. She's the mother of my children. And yet you think I'm going to exchange Israel? How can I exchange Israel? Now, this is all a midrash, right? This is all a kind of a filler, right? That's not in the text. At the same time, it absolutely draws forth an aspect of what the symbolic action is doing, right?
Miriam?
Yes.
Hoshea doesn't actually tell Hashem to ditch Israel.
No, he does not. He does not. He absolutely does not. He does not. And it's interesting that it has a story right after saying that he's like the greatest prophet of the 4 prophets who prophesied at the same time. So right after it says he's the greatest of those prophets, it goes right into the story where it's saying he did terrible things, right? Like you could kind of understand this. It's a bit Eliyahu-like from what we saw with Eliyahu, how Eliyahu reacted. But no, Hoshea does not say this. He is pretty harsh with Israel, but absolutely not. No, and he. But this why do we have this text? Because it's important. It's very hard. Moshe Matatiah just made this point in the chat. The Gemara effectively transfers the harshness of God's statements to the prophet instead. This is true, but it doesn't need to, because God frequently makes such harsh statements. Like I think it's more to explain how God could tell him to do this than to explain how God is saying harsh things, right? But yes, it is absolutely. God says they're not my people, right? God says they're not my people. God says I'm not going to have mercy on them. So and in this thing, Hoshea is saying, oh, so choose someone else, choose a different people, right? And the whole point is God's like, no, I would do that? You won't throw away your prostitute wife, and I am supposed to throw away Israel, right? But it is, again, showing why that analogy of God as husband and Israel as wife is such a strong one. Because the idea is, this idea, God's constantly saying, you're betraying me. You're going to other gods. I've done everything for you and you're not recognizing it. I send prophets to you and you don't listen to them. So why is God still holding out for us? And it's because of this strong relationship and this strong, in a way, unbreakable bond, even though of course it is breakable, right? And in the Torah and it's always been breakable, right? But it's as if it's not breakable, right? Because there's this idea of you're the wife of my you're the wife of my youth, of your youth rather. You're the wife. In your youth you were connected to me. You remember we have that, and that's a picture that we have in Yirmiyahu, especially in Yirmiyahu, right? And in Yechezkel, this idea that you were a woman who was attached to me, who loved me. We had this unbreakable bond. Now, you could argue, well, it's less love and more covenant and an agreement. But what's being talked about here really is in terms of love, of renewing love, right? That I'm going to take you back to the wilderness and we're going to renew this love that we had. And that's a big part of this analogy of the relationship, and that God hasn't given up on Israel, because this strong connection still exists even with Israel doing all these things. And I think the passage in the Talmud that we read brings out this idea. He's like, hey, but she's a prostitute, right? So what do you care? No, she's my wife. She's the mother of my children. I can't just divorce her. And God's like, right, that's right. Okay, so that is, I think, a sort of an idea that's coming across to us in the biblical passage. Actually, let me see if I can here. So if we go back to the passage for just a second, so we can see a little bit more of this, because I stopped before some of the prettiest part of it. Here we go. All right. So we have, and this is, of course, you're all familiar with this. So God's like, I'm going to take her, I'm going to kind of lure her into the wilderness to renew this relationship after everything's gone, starting with a clean slate, right? וחרתי להם ברית ביום ההוא עם חיית השדה ועם עוף השמיים ורמס האדמה וקשת וחרב ומלחמה אשבור מן הארץ ושכבתים לבטח. So I'm going to make a covenant with them and with the animals and with the birds. It's kind of a recreation. It's like a new covenant with the world, not just with Israel, right? And with everything creeping on the earth. And the bow and sword and war is going to be broken from the land. There's not going to be any more war. I'm going to settle them securely. Ve'erastichli leolam, ve'erastichli b'tzedek u'mishpat u'v'chesed u'v'rachamim. And I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you to me with justice and with law and with kindness and with mercy. Ve'erastichli be'emunah ve'yadat et Adonai. And I will betroth you to me with faithfulness, and you will know and you will know God, right? And then just to skip a little bit ahead, Uzrati ali ba'aretz v'richamti et lo ruchama v'amarti lilo ami ata v'hu yomar Elohai. And I will plant her into me in the land, and I will have mercy on lo ruchama, on the person who, on the non-mercied, right? And I will say to not my nation, you are my nation, and he will say, my God, right? And it's that recognition, it's that renewal of the covenant that that Hoshea is reaching for here, that God is reaching for here in Hoshea's prophecies, right? So this idea that we're gonna start with a clean slate. Clean slate. If you push me, if you don't argue with your mother, if you don't stop this kind of behavior, then what's going to happen is I'm going to take everything. Everything's going to be gone. So you're going to be going back to the wilderness, and we're going to start over. And we're going to start over, and we're going to renew this covenant. And this covenant is going to include justice, and it's also going to include compassion, right? And once more we'll be joined. Now, it's true. You can argue and say, oh, this is not a love relationship, it's a relationship of a covenant. I do think that just from this it is talking about this kind of we still have this connection, and that's why I'm not giving up, even though you're betraying me. I see a comment here from Danny and Libby. There would seem to be a problem with this prophecy insofar it seems to be encouraging the people not to take the word of God seriously. I beg to differ. I mean, all the prophecies are always going to be like, okay, guys, you're sinning, stop sinning or else, right? And the idea is you can stop sinning now and still come back. There are sometimes prophecies that are like, it's too late, and I'm just telling you what's going to happen. Yirmiyahu gets to say those a lot because he has that kind of luck. But in general, the point of a prophecy is supposed to be for the people to repent. Here, actually, if you really see it as at least is the way I presented it tonight, the point is, if you guys don't do something, if you guys don't switch, I'm taking everything. I kind of went through it a little bit quickly, but the idea is you're going to lose everything, and then we're going to renew it. Then we're going to start over. So if you don't argue with your mother, then you're going to lose everything. and then we'll start over. If you argue with your mother, you still have a way back, right? If you stop with this idol worship, you can still come back. If you don't, you're going to lose everything first. I'm still connected. I will still make this connection with you, right? But it's not going to be fun. You're not going to go through like fun, happy times before the connection's renewed. But it is interesting that it's true that with Hoshea, with all the harshness, there is this expectation that that the covenant will be renewed. But you see this a lot. Actually, maybe I'll start talking about the renewal of the covenant as an idea in different prophets also later in the class. I'll make a note for myself. But you do have, of course, in Yirmiyahu classically, they all have this idea of kind of renewing, cleansing, and then a renewal, right? Which is not that surprising that you would have that as kind of almost a trope. But we see it very clearly here with Hoshea. I don't think it has to weaken the message. I think at least it says that there's a strong relationship, and prophets go back and forth a lot of times between saying there's a strong relationship that can't be broken and you've broken it. Right? You've broken it. Who are you to me now? You're not anything, right? You'll have those in the same prophecies next to each other. But I don't think that here it nullifies the weight of it.
In general here, it seems like Hoshea is delivering this metaphor at the expense of taking the anthropomorphization of God to an absolute extreme. On one hand, he's saying, lo ami, and then he just make, okay, only kidding. And then in the ve'erastichli, v'yadatet Hashem.
Here, you know what? Let's go because we have a few minutes, but we don't really have. I mean, just bear with me. The next chapter is really short, and it kind of has a summary of it. So let me go to that to kind of show you what I'm thinking of. Okay, so this is Hoshea Perek Gimel, Hoshea chapter 3. Okay, so and it's still on the same thing, right? It's like a summary of the previous. It's V'yomer Adonai Elai od lecha havisha ahuvat rea umena afet ka'avat Adonai et bnei Israel v'hem ponim el Elohim acherim v'ohavei ashishe anavim. In case you missed the previous metaphor, let's just spell it out.
We're not seeing the text.
Oh, you're not seeing the text?
We're seeing another document.
Okay, hold on just a second. I'm going to start again. Sorry about that. Let me try again. Oh, I see. Okay, hold on. This is great. There. Okay, do we see it now? Okay, great. All right, back. Okay, so I'm on Hoshea Gimel, Hoshea 3, and we're having, and it's kind of a summary in case you missed what it was getting at in the previous two chapters. It's kind of a summary. It says, Vayomer Adonai Elai od lech ehav isha ahuvat rea umena afet ka'ahavat Adonai et bnei Yisrael v'hem ponim el Elohim acherim v'ohavei ashishe anavim. So God said to me, go love a woman who is unfaithful, right? Who loves other men and cheats, sleeps around, as God loves the children of Israel, and they are turning to other gods. And they love, kind of the fruit of the cakes of raisins. Okay, it's a question of, are the cakes of raisins meant to be gifts to idol worship, or does it just mean that they like wine? And so he says, I gave her silver, I gave her barley. V'omar eleha yamim rabim teshvili lo tizni v'lo tihi ish. So for many, and I said to her, you're going to sit solitary for many days. You're not going to be with any other men, and I'm not going to be yours either. You're going to be sitting alone. You're not going to have your lovers, and you're not going to have me. Ki yamim rabim yeshvu bnei Yisrael en melech ve'en sar ve'en zevach ve'en matzeva ve'en ephod utrafim. Okay, for many days, Israel is gonna sit without a king, without a leader, without sacrifices, without a maseva, without ways of telling God's will. They ephod or they're trafim, right? Trafim are a little iffy, right? But the ephod is a classic way of legitimate oracular device, seems to be. Achar yeshuvu bnei Israel. Afterwards, the children of Israel return and they'll seek God, right? ufachadu el Hashem ve'al tuvo b'acharit yamim, right? And they'll be frightened towards, like they'll have appropriate fear of God and his goodness at the end of days. So what's going to happen? You're going to have a bad period. So listen, you'll go love a woman like I love Israel. It's awful, right? I think I've told you before, I really should have shown it to you. There's a comic that always comes to my mind. It's like this guy he's kind of dressed in a robe, and he has like a staff, and he's sitting in a bar. He's talking to another guy in a bar, and he's like, and he's a prophet. He's clearly a prophet. And he says, yeah, he's like, excuse my language here. He says, yeah, my wife's a cheating whore, but she makes a great metaphor. Right. So this is the idea here that go love a woman like I have loved Israel, right? Where even if they cheat, I'm still there. But but because she cheats, she's gonna sit for years with nothing and no one. She's not gonna have her lover, she's not gonna have me, she's not gonna have a leader, she's not gonna know what to do. And after that period of time, which is going to be long, she's gonna return to me. Right. So that's the idea that that you're going to go through this period. God is there for you, but you're going to go through a period where you've got nothing, where you don't have God and you don't have anyone else because of the way you're behaving. Right. And that's needed for this kind of reset that's going to happen. And that's kind of the summary there. So anyways, we see that here, the symbolic actions by Hoshea is really kind of meant to really bring home this idea, this new metaphor, this new idea of God as Israel's husband, with all that implies. The deep connection, the feeling of betrayal, right? And the idea that, no, you can't just go to other gods and come back to the God of Israel. You owe your allegiance only to the God of Israel. And that should be clear. That should be obvious, right? And in order to really bring that home, you have the prophet doing the ultimate symbolic action of actually taking a wife and having kids, where that's where you're supposed to be, where you're supposed to see that as a concrete example of this sort of relationship. Okay, so everyone, thank you for joining me. And in our next class, we're going to look at symbolic actions in Yirmiyahu. So looking forward to seeing you next time, and everyone have a good night.